This program is brought to you in part by SalCal Real Estate Connections.
Yes, welcome. Today we're going to have George Dragon with another adventure with history of the automobile. And George, we got a very interesting piece we have behind you today that I think you know a little bit about.
Yes, Larry, how are you? This is a 1912 Fiat. Now, people know Fiats that are built today, but this is an American Fiat. They were built under license in Poughkeepsie, New York from 1910 to 1917. So this is considered an American Fiat with American body. Most of the components were built in the United States. Fiat only sent the engine and the transmission and a few other parts. But everything was built in a factory in Poughkeepsie, New York, and they were very successful. And the reason why Fiat decided to build cars here was they had a selling branch in New York City, which was huge. They sold many different cars, and also Fiat raced in the United States. So Fiat had a very good image here, and they had a good selling base, so that they decided to start building the cars here under license.
Now, when you talk about racing, what kind of racing was it? I mean, was it road racing or Indianapolis or?
Well, it was before Indianapolis that Fiat got into racing. Actually, it was in 1905, and it was mostly road racing. There was some closed tracks racing around Empire City and some of the other ones around New York, but they hired a fellow that may be known to some of your listeners as one of their first racing drivers, and his name was Louis Chevrolet.
Wow.
And he was a mechanic for Fiat, and their actual first racing driver, Emmanuel Cedrino, was killed in the race, so they had to replace him quickly for a local race that was coming up. So they asked Louis Chevrolet if he could drive a race car, and he said, sure, why not? And he got behind the wheel, and he won the race that day and won hundreds of other races in Fiats between 1905 and 1908.
I had no idea. Louis Chevrolet. Wow. Tell me that in a special. Now, who else drove for them?
Well, one of their better racing drivers was Ralph De Palma, who was in between, say, 1905 in the early 20s. He was in 3,500 races, but he also was one of the star race drivers for Fiat in the early days.
What a history there. Wow. I had no idea. And building this car in the United States, tell me exactly, where was the plant?
Well, it was in Poughkeepsie, New York, and it was actually right off where Route 9 is right now. It was a huge plant that was built by American artisans at that time. They actually built their bricks and everything right there on site. And how I know about this was when they went to knock the building down a few years ago, they had really a heck of a time because the building was built so well that I think they went through 3 or 4 wrecking balls just to knock the building down. Now, they were only in business building these cars from 1910 to 1917, and then it was turned over to be used for the war effort. They built Liberty aero engines in that factory. So after World War I, Fiat decided not to continue on with production here because they were able to build more and send just as many cars from Italy to the United States as they were building here.
Now, when they were building cars here, there was an advantage as far as paying tariffs and taxes too, right?
Right. Well, that was the advantage. The import duties were huge at that time. As a matter of fact, they weren't the only ones. Mercedes built cars in the New York City area. There was a car called American Mercedes. Also Daimler and quite a few other companies, including Rolls-Royces, were built in the United States. And that was all to get around the import duties at the time.
Yeah, the Springfield cars are special. When I go to shows today to look at those cars, I mean, they were nice cars.
Oh, yes, right. I mentioned earlier that I think that the American Rolls-Royces were superior to the British-built ones.
That's interesting, I'll tell you. Now, when Fiat was selling these cars here or building them here, was the sales good?
Yes, well, that was the idea. They were selling so many cars, they were having a hard time shipping enough cars from Italy. So that's when they set up this factory. They were building enough cars, and people at the time, I think their customers liked the idea that it was also an American-built Fiat. But they were very expensive cars at the time. They had a very exclusive clientele. They built both 4 and 6 cylinder cars, and this one is a 6 cylinder model 56.
Now, this it was 1914, this car?
This is a 1912, and probably a 1914 will look basically the same, but the radiator shape changed at that time. They went to a rounder radiator shape that they kept right up until the early 30s.
Did they have many different models like this car?
They only had 4 or 5 models. They didn't want to really spread it out, but they had 2 different 6-cylinder models and 3 different 4-cylinder models.
Well, I'll tell you, the car is definitely gorgeous. But I have to say, there's a soft spot in my heart for that red car you got, that race car.
Right, you're referring to our 1907 Fiat chain drive racer.
That's absolutely right. I love that car. And in this car here, I mean, was that the original color, or you think, or no?
As far as we know, it's the original color. It's a Fleetwood body. So Fleetwood bodies, people think about Cadillac Fleetwood. Well, Fleetwood was an early bodybuilder for lots of different companies. So this is mostly all aluminum Fleetwood body, brought from Fleetwood, Pennsylvania. And every car was custom ordered. This one was originally owned by a hotel near Schenectady, New York, and it's a 7-passenger touring car. But they made huge limousines. They even made 2-passenger roadsters. But really, I think the bulk of the cars that they sold were 7-passenger tourings like this.
Now, this car, does it have electric start?
It does have electric start now. Originally in 1912, it was a hand crank start. Really, electric starter wasn't invented until about 1912. So this car was sent back to the factory in 1914 and had electric starter installed, and the lights were electrified also.
Boy, I'll tell you, you had to be a free spirit to turn this thing over, I bet.
Right, and imagine on a cold day trying to crank this 6-cylinder, what they consider 75 horsepower, which was really almost 200 horsepower in reality. To crank a car like this, really, you had to have a strong chauffeur.
Not kidding. Wow, you needed a gorilla.
That's true, right.
Now, when you talk about sending these cars back to Fiat, we're talking about on a boat, right? How long would it take to do something like that?
You mean when the cars were shipped here from Fiat in Italy? Yeah. Well, that was the problem. That's the reason they decided to set up the factory here, because, sometimes it would take 2 months to get 2 to 3 months to get an order of cars for the New York dealer, and they were out of cars. So this way, they were built in Poughkeepsie, New York. They could put in an order, and they could finish these cars in probably a couple of weeks.
Wow, that is really interesting history. Tell me something about the motor in this car. It is a 6-cylinder. Is it like the normal motor during the day?
Well, Fiat was one of the first to do a monoblock 6-cylinder. A lot of the 6-cylinders were cast in pairs at that time, 3 and 3. This has a monoblock 6-cylinder. It's got twin ignition, means it has 12 spark plugs, and the exhaust manifold is cast right into the block. So that helps kept the engine warm in the winter, and helped starting, and also performance-wise, having the exhaust manifold cast into the block. But yes, it's quite a large engine, powerful, plus a 4-speed transmission. So the 4th gear is in overdrive. So you're going 50 miles an hour in 3rd before you even shift into 4th, which is an overdrive, and it really takes off. This car easily cruises at 70 miles an hour.
Now, technology-wise, where would you place this car during the period against American cars?
equal, if not superior, to Packard and Pierce Arrow at that time, because Packard and Pierce Arrow were basically the same cars, and we're talking about 1912. They still had the technology of 1907 and 1908. This car was really far superior as far as the engine technology, and it still used a magneto, but it was, as I said, it was twin ignition, and as far as the cooling and the transmission, the way the gearing is, I think it's superior to Packard and Pierce Arrow of the time.
You know, the other question that comes to my mind, when you own one of these cars, I mean, where do you bring it to get serviced?
Here, you mean? I mean, today we do restoration, so we have a restoration shop.
Oh, no, I meant in the day.
You went to the Fiat selling branch in New York City, was the largest repair shop. They had a 5-story building in New York City at the time, and they had all mechanics, and they were working on a lot of the cars. Not a lot of smaller dealerships around, like any local corner gas station or someone that owned a building in a town could get a dealership. Maybe not Cadillac, but Overland and Metz and a lot of the other more common cars of the time. You really had to have deep pockets to set up a Fiat dealership at that time. And it was only in the major cities, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, probably Cleveland. You know, those major cities had the big dealerships for Fiat.
So we're saying that probably more prominent people would own this kind of car.
Oh, absolutely. This car was $6,600 new.
Wow.
Right, when a Model T at that time was $850.
Yeah, a little bit of difference. I could see that. But I'll tell you, George, this car is just gorgeous. I mean, it's beautiful everywhere you look. And the thinking and technology, you could see it. You know?
Right. They were all hand built, but the thing about Fiat was they hired the best workers from Europe. Mostly Europeans worked there, so they were familiar with these cars if they worked at Fiat in Italy, but also here the best mechanics that worked on those cars. You know, Fiat stepped up, and they didn't really build that many cars. I think on average they only built about 10 cars a day, so they were all hand built.
10 cars a day.
Right. Compared to Ford, who in 1914, when the assembly line started, where he would build, thousands a day.
Yeah, that's special, I'll tell you. Now, would you consider this car in the brass era or no?
Yes, absolutely. It's a brass trim. Anything 1915 or earlier is considered a brass era car.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I am just at awe when I look at this car. Beautiful, beautiful. Well, we're going to have to take a look at the motor. I'm kind of interested to see what that looks like. And I can't get over this 4-speed transmission. That was like, in the day, that was special, right?
It was. Only the better cars had 4-speed transmissions. But my 1907 Fiat is a 4-speed also. Yes, so, the technology here in the U.S., we were lucky to have 2-speed transmissions before 1910 on a lot of cars. So 3-speed became the norm by 1912, and only the performance cars had 4-speed transmissions.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah, we're going to take a little look at the motor of this car, and I got a feeling we're in for a little surprise how this motor looks. What do you think, George?
Oh, absolutely. Nothing like you've seen before.
Okay. Well, George, we opened up the hood here, and this motor looks special. I mean, I never seen a head that big. Look at the way tell us about this motor.
Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, it's a monoblock, so it's a cast iron, one-piece block for a 6-cylinder. I don't know of any American car companies at that time that were building cars with a monoblock. As I mentioned, there were 2 sets of 3, or sometimes 3 sets of 2 cylinders. This one is all encompassed in one cast iron block with the exhaust manifold cast into the head of the top of the block. It does have twin ignition, and which means it has 12 spark plugs. And basically it was very far ahead of its time. because all engines became monoblock starting pretty much around 1915 or 16.
So they really were the first ones venturing into this kind of deal, right?
Yes, they were. They had much success with the four-cylinder monoblock earlier, and then they made this large casting in Italy for the six-cylinder cars.
Wow. I'm going to tell you, this motor looks huge. I don't know how big it is. Boy, it's pretty big.
Yes, I think it's about 10.5 liters, and it is, as I mentioned, this is considered a 75 horsepower model, which was the largest at the time. Now, 75 horsepower was a taxable, what they call a taxable horsepower. There was a special formula. In reality, this engine was over 150 horsepower.
But they kept it low just not to pay the tax.
Well, cars were taxed at the time on their horsepower in Europe, so that's why eventually, and after the war, engines got smaller and smaller because the taxes were going higher and higher on the horsepower and the bore and stroke, and then also on the size of the engine.
No, you were telling me, I mean, this car literally went 70 miles an hour?
Oh yeah, it'll easily do 70 miles an hour today in the four-speed transmission.
Wow. Boy, he had to be a free spirit back then.
Right. Well, it's a heavy body, but it's all made out of aluminum. It's a Fleetwood body, so that lightens it up. But I'm going to say the whole car pretty much weighs about 5,200 pounds.
Well, very good. I'll tell you, you know, these cars just fascinate me, and I just can't get over the history involved in these cars. And we're going to have to talk more about Fiat in the future because this, to me, it looks like they were a very special company.
Absolutely. Well, they've been here since 1905 in the United States selling cars, and they're very popular today, again.
Yeah. Well, we're going to go over now and move over to a different car, but I have to tell you, these Fiats got a really soft spot in my heart, especially that 1907 race car. Just gorgeous. And I'll tell you, when it comes to the history of these cars, George knows what's going on without a doubt. And next, we're going to go on to our next little adventure here in the next very special car. Our next adventure in the history of the car, George, is this interesting 1924 Marmon, which I really don't know too much about these cars, but tell me, this company has a little history.
Right. Again, another company that has racing history like the Fiat. Marmon cars were built in Indianapolis, Indiana. They started in 1905, but they're most famous for their performance cars that came out around 1911. Actually, the first car to win the Indianapolis 500 in 1911 was a Marmon Wasp, which was a race car that still exists. It's in the Indianapolis Motor Museum, and that pretty much started them on the road to having performance cars. People bought them because once they won the Indianapolis 500, people thought they were so reliable. It helped sell the regular touring cars and roadsters, and also put them on the road to racing.
Do I dare ask you whereabouts location-wise they start building these cars?
Oh, in Indianapolis, Indiana, right where the Indianapolis 500 is. And in Indianapolis, there were many cars built there, many car companies. Marmon started as a small car company building air-cooled cars the first couple of years, and then started building generic touring cars, but the engines started getting larger, so they really needed a jolt to get them more publicity. So they built this. They heard about the Indianapolis 500-mile race was going to start in 1911, so they entered this car called the Marmon Wasp, which was painted bright yellow, and it was actually the first car to have a rear view mirror. The driver felt that he should be able to see who was coming up behind him. And you could find this car online, but if you would really want to see it in person, it's at the Indianapolis Motor Museum right inside the racetrack.
So it didn't take long for the automobile people to realize racing would play a big role in how they would advertise the car.
Well, absolutely, because that was what got your name in the paper. If you were part of a race, It was a little bit of publicity, but if you won a race at the time, that was front page news. And that was the only way people got, this was way before radio and television, and this is the only way that you were able to read about what was happening in the world was in newspapers. And the car companies caught on that if they won races, they would get front page news. And as I mentioned, if they won a race, people thought the cars were very reliable and it would be a good car to buy.
Now, the motor they would use in the day, even this car, what kind of motor did they have?
They were four-cylinder. Well, they started with air-cooled cars and then became four-cylinder cars in late 1906. Then they went on to build six-cylinder cars, and very expensive cars in the early teens. The first ones were cast in pairs, and then they went to a monoblock design like the Fiat around 1914.
I mean, so they had performance on their mind right from the get-go.
They did, and then especially when they designed this car, this is known as a Marmon Model 34 Speedster. The first Marmon Speedster went to a famous racing driver by the name of Barney Oldfield. He got the first car, and he actually used it as a pace car for the 1919 Indianapolis 500.
Yeah, he's very famous. I remember he had like a Ford car. They called it a 999 or something.
Well, that's actually the first car he raced for Henry Ford. He was a bicycle racer, and Henry Ford hired him he was a very successful bicycle racer, and Henry Ford put him behind the wheel of his 999 Racer, which was named after a famous fast train at the time, which was the 999. So, but it didn't have a steering wheel. Henry Ford set up the steering like had bicycle handles on the steering car. But he was fearless, and people would remember Barney Oldfield if you saw pictures, because he always had a cigar in his mouth. And the reason why is not to be he was a heavy smoker, but these early cars, your teeth would chatter, or he felt that it would keep his his teeth from getting damaged on going in these rough dirt-tracked racetracks by racing these cars. So, but he was a household name, very famous. Another fellow that won hundreds and hundreds of races, and he was a hero to to kids and everyone at the time because he was very flamboyant. He was a fearless race car driver. So Marmon wanted to get really that much more publicity, so they gave him the first Marmon Speedster like this that was built in 1919, and it was painted bright yellow.
And he went on, of course, to win the very first race, right?
No, he did not win.
He didn't.
A fellow by the name of Ray Haroon won the first race in 1911, and Barney Oldfield never raced for Marmon. He raced for lots of people, but he did not race for Marmon.
Oh, I'll tell you. I got to ask you something. Back in the day when Marmon was building cars and designing cars, were they tied into any other companies to help them along, or did they buy like parts from one or the other?
Well, they built their own cars, but of course they bought parts from Timken, like bearings and axles, and sometimes rear ends. But most of the rest of the car was built at the Marmon factory.
So what was their design right from the get-go? Whatever they put in this car, it was their making.
That's right, absolutely, and they're designers. This car has unusual short fenders with long running boards. It's very sporty, two-seater, no rumble seat. It was only this was like sort of like a Playboy's car at the time.
I would have loved to live in that time frame, huh, George?
Right, absolutely.
Well, we're going to take a look at the motor of this car and see what made this thing tick. What do you think of that?
It's one of my favorite cars.
Okay. Yes, George, I'm looking at this motor, and boy, it's a pretty one, I'll tell you that. Tell me about this motor.
Well, it is impressive because it's so tall. It's a long stroke engine, six-cylinder, overhead valve. If you notice, it still has an updraft carburetor. They didn't go to downdraft carburetors on most cars till the 1930s, but it does have the original Zenith dual throat carburetor. And these cars were known as performance cars, and that's why Marmon stuck with that image right till the end. The end of the Marmon company was in 1933, and the last cars they built were 16-cylinder cars with all aluminum V16. But if you notice, they started using aluminum on these cars back then. They knew aluminum for lightness. The whole crankcase is aluminum on this. So they knew lightness with lots of horsepower meant cars would go fast.
Well, I am so impressed at the fact that performance was a big deal with this company.
It was, right. Just a lot of companies relied on a performance aspect because you had so many options, so many cars that you could pick from. If someone was going out there, just like, in recent years here, or we talk about the muscle car era, this was really sort of a muscle car of the 1920s because it's only a two-seater, very lightweight body with a high-performance engine.
I have to say, it is pretty. I mean, everywhere I look in this car, it's got a beautiful feature. I see that polished intake there. Is that normal?
Yes. Oh, yeah. That's all aluminum intake that was polished. They tried to make it look as well as it ran at the time, and that was very attractive. Actually, that carburetor new was probably polished brass also.
Now, is this a gravity feed or no, or how does the fuel get to the motor here?
It is unusual that this is gravity feed. The gas tank is in the cowl, so it's a gravity feed, no fuel pump.
Just like the old Model A days, right? Okay, George, looks like we covered this Marmon pretty good, and I have to tell you, the car is really gorgeous. I can't get over the history of this thing here. I mean, it's like an adventure talking about these things. What do you think about Marmon in general? You think that, why did they go out of business?
They were, because of the Depression, they were, one of the car companies that couldn't survive, and they put all their chips on the V16. Instead of going with a cheaper car, they went for a more expensive car at the wrong time.
Yeah, that was usually the case. Well, you got it on the Marmon, and let me tell you, I'm going to have to get my history books out because I am really interested to know a little further more about these cars. George, you always get my interest going, and I'll tell you, I'm never the same when I leave here.
Thank you, Larry.
Okay, thank you. Please give us feedback on tonight's show. What do you think about having a weekly show in the future with George Dragon regarding the history of the automobile? Please email us at raceaction@aol.com. Please return next week to our next episode of Racing Action Today.